I died in the apocalypse. Then I woke up 3 years earlier, and the woman who killed me was my girlfriend. My name is Anthony Barnes. I was 28 years old when I died, and 25 when I woke up. The math doesn't work unless you accept that time is not the straight line we pretend, that memory can be a weapon, that the universe occasionally permits second chances to those who didn't deserve to lose their first. The dying was bad. The waking was worse. I died in year 3 of the collapse, the fungal plague that started in agricultural centers and spread through food supply chains before anyone understood what was happening. By the time the CDC issued warnings, 40% of the population was already infected. By year 2, the infrastructure we assumed was permanent, electricity, running water, law enforcement, had become theoretical. By year 3, we were animals in expensive ruins, killing each other for canned goods and antibiotics. I died in an abandoned hospital in Cleveland. Elena, my girlfriend, my partner, the woman I had trusted with my life, had stolen our supplies 3 days earlier. She left me with a knife wound in my thigh, infected, weeping, the kind of injury that would have been survivable with antibiotics and impossible without. I lay in a maternity ward, surrounded by rusted beds and the bones of infants who had died before the world noticed, and I watched the fever take me. I was not brave. I did not accept death with dignity. I screamed for Elena, for my mother, for God, for anyone. I cursed her. I cursed myself for trusting her. I died hating her, which felt like failure, like letting her win, like dying as the person she had made me rather than the person I had been. Then I woke up. The apartment was familiar in the way of dreams, wrong in details, correct in feeling. The water stain on the ceiling I had meant to report to the landlord. The bookshelf with the science fiction novels I had read in college and never discarded. The window that faced east, that leaden morning light I had taken for granted every day of a life that was, apparently, about to end. I knew immediately. The knowledge was physical, cellular, the way you know you are breathing. I had been here before. I had lived this life. I had made choices in this room. What to wear, what to eat, whether to call in sick to a job I hated, that had led me to Cleveland, to the hospital, to the maternity ward with its infant bones. I checked my phone. The date confirmed it. March 15th, 2021. 2 months before the first outbreak. 3 years before I would die. I vomited in the bathroom. Not from shock, from grief. The memory of dying was fresh, immediate, more real than the ceramic tile under my knees. I could smell the hospital, the particular stench of abandonment and decay. I could feel the fever, the way it made thinking impossible, the way it reduced me to sensation and need. I could taste the hatred, bitter, futile, the last emotion I had experienced as Anthony Barnes, version 1. I looked in the mirror. I was younger. Not dramatically, 3 years is not nothing, but it's not transformative. I was thinner, though. The muscle I had built in the collapse, the survival strength was gone. I was soft, civilian, unprepared. I touched my face, my unmarked thigh, and I wept for the body that had survived so much and been erased so completely. The weeping passed. It had to. I had died with hatred in my heart, but I had woken with something else, knowledge. Memory of what was coming. 3 years of experience, of mistakes, of learning what worked and what didn't in a world that had stopped making sense. I had a second chance. Not to stop the apocalypse, I was not delusional. One man, even with foreknowledge, cannot prevent a global pandemic. The systems were too large, the failures too distributed, the timeline too compressed. By the time anyone with authority would listen to me, it would be too late. But I could prepare. I could survive. I could perhaps save others. And I could understand Elena, the Elena of this timeline, who was currently my girlfriend, who loved me, or appeared to, who had not yet betrayed me, who had not yet left me to die in a maternity ward surrounded by bones. I could watch her. I could learn what I had missed. I could decide, with 3 years of warning, whether to trust her or to leave her. That decision felt urgent, immediate, more pressing than food or shelter or the antibiotics I would need to stockpile. I had died hating her, but I had not died understanding her. The collapse had come too fast for explanations. One day she was my partner, my ally, my lover. The next she was gone with our supplies, with my hope, with my life. I needed to know why. And I needed to know if it was inevitable. I called in sick to work. I had been a project manager for a logistics company, coordinating shipments of consumer goods that would, in 2 years, become priceless and in 3 years become irrelevant. The job was meaningless to me now, a distraction from the real work of survival. But I maintained it, initially, for cover, for income, for the appearance of normalcy, while I prepared for the abnormal. I spent the first week in research. Not online, the internet would be monitored eventually, and I needed to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention. I used libraries, cash purchases of newspapers, the careful accumulation of public information that would let me track the plague's progress without leaving digital traces. I knew the timeline. The first agricultural cases in June. The first human cases in August. The CDC announcement in September, too late. The lockdowns in October, too porous. The collapse of supply chains by December, the beginning of the real dying. I had 8 months to prepare. 8 months to become someone who could survive what was coming. I started with location. Cleveland had been a mistake. Too cold, too dense, too dependent on infrastructure that would fail early. I needed rural, southern, agricultural, somewhere I could grow food, somewhere the population was sparse enough to avoid the worst of the violence, somewhere the climate would permit survival without the energy infrastructure that would collapse. I found a property in rural Tennessee, 40 acres with a spring, a barn that could be fortified, soil that could be cultivated. The price was $180,000, which consumed most of my savings and required a mortgage I would never pay off. I bought it through a shell company, layers of legal protection that would hopefully delay, if not prevent, the property seizure when the government eventually tried to consolidate resources. I told Elena about the property 3 weeks after I woke up. We were having dinner at her apartment, something I had cooked, something normal. She was beautiful in the way I remembered. Dark hair, sharp features, the intensity that had attracted me initially and would, I now knew, become dangerous. "I want to show you something," I said. "A project I've been thinking about." I showed her pictures of the property. The barn, the spring, the land. I told her I was thinking of a retreat, a place to escape the city, to practice sustainability, to prepare for. I hesitated, careful, feeling my way, for whatever comes next. Climate change. Economic instability. It feels like things are getting fragile. She looked at the pictures with interest. Genuine as far as I could tell. "This is serious money, Anthony. You're talking about leaving your job? Your life here?" "Not immediately, but eventually. I want to build something. Something resilient. I want you to be part of it." I was testing her. I knew I was testing her. I wanted to see if the Elena of this timeline, pre-collapse, pre-betrayal, was different from the one I had known. If the capacity for abandonment was already present, or if it had been created by circumstances I could, perhaps, prevent. She took my hand. "I love that you're thinking this way. It's attractive, the competence of it. But I need to understand more. What would I do there? What would we do?" "Live," I said. "Survive. Be ready for whatever comes." She nodded, noncommittal, and changed the subject. I let her. I was watching, learning, storing information for analysis. This was the Elena I had fallen in love with, ambitious, practical, cautious about commitment. The Elena who would leave me had not yet emerged, or had not yet been revealed. The preparation consumed the next 6 months. I maintained my job, my apartment, my relationship, all cover for the real work of becoming ready. I liquidated investments, converted cash to tangible assets, established supply caches and locations between the city and my property. I learned skills I had acquired too late in my first life. Basic surgery, water purification, solar power installation, the cultivation of food in quantities sufficient to sustain life. Elena participated selectively. She visited the property twice, helped with some construction, contributed ideas about security and organization. But she maintained her own life, her job in marketing, her friendships, her family connections. She was not, she made clear, ready to abandon everything for my vision of apocalyptic preparation. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself that I was the one with impossible knowledge, that I couldn't expect her to match my urgency without sharing my information, that her caution was rational rather than ominous. But I watched. I documented. I created records of her movements, her communications, her spending patterns. I told myself this was security, was protection, was the minimum prudence required by my situation. I did not examine whether it was also distrust, also trauma, also the inability to love without verification. The outbreak began in June, on schedule. Agricultural cases in the Midwest, initially misidentified as bacterial contamination. I tracked the progression with the sick certainty of confirmation. It was happening. Everything I remembered was happening again. I told Elena in July. We were at the property installing solar panels when I made the decision. I needed her to understand, needed her to believe, needed, desperately, to prevent the betrayal I knew was coming by creating a foundation of honesty I had failed to build in my first life. I need to tell you something, I said. Something impossible. Something you'll want to dismiss as paranoia or mental illness. But I need you to listen. To really listen. I told her. The plague, the timeline, the collapse. My death in Cleveland, her betrayal, my waking 3 years earlier. I told her everything, watching her face shift from concern to confusion to something I couldn't identify. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then, Anthony, this is a lot. This is either true, which is terrifying, or you believe it's true, which is also terrifying. I need time. I need to think. There's no time, I said. The outbreak is already happening. By September, everyone will know. By December, the world we know will be gone. I need you to believe me now. To act now. To come with me, prepare with me, survive with me. She left the next morning. Said she needed to think, to process, to decide. She drove back to the city in her car, the one I had filled with supplies for her safety, and she did not call for 3 days. When she returned, she was different. Quieter, more focused, less resistant. She said she had researched, had found the early reports I had referenced, had concluded that something was happening even if she couldn't accept my explanation of how I knew. I'll stay, she said. I'll help. But I need you to understand, I don't believe you died and woke up. I believe you're perceptive, that you see patterns others miss, that you've constructed this narrative to manage your anxiety about real threats. I'm here for the real threats, not the story. I accepted this. It was partial belief, partial commitment, but it was more than I had expected. We worked together through August, through September, as the news worsened and the panic began. We fortified the property, established supply chains, recruited 2 other couples who had become convinced of the coming disaster through their own channels. The Elena of this period was dedicated, competent, essential. She managed our food inventory with precision, negotiated with local farmers for equipment and seed, created communication protocols with other prepared communities in the region. I watched her for signs of the betrayal I remembered, found none, and allowed myself to hope that knowledge had changed the outcome. The CDC announcement came in September as I remembered. The lockdowns in October. The first wave of deaths in November, not from the plague directly, but from the system's response. Hospital overwhelm, supply disruption, the cascade of failures that killed more efficiently than the fungus itself. We were ready. More ready than I had been in my first life, when I had spent the early months in denial, in hope that the authorities would contain the threat, in the fatal delay that had left me vulnerable when the real collapse began. By December, we were 12 people on 40 acres, armed, supplied, organized. We had contact with similar groups across 3 states, a network of mutual aid and information sharing that would, I believed, permit regional survival even as the national structure dissolved. Elena and I were partners in this. Genuine partners, sleeping together, planning together, facing the emerging darkness as a unit. I had told her the truth, my impossible truth, and she had stayed. The betrayal I remembered had not occurred. I had changed the future by changing myself, by trusting her with knowledge, by building honesty where secrecy had failed. This was my triumph. This was my second chance, realized. Then the dreams began. They started in January. Elena, asleep beside me, would twitch and murmur. Words I couldn't understand, languages I didn't recognize. She would wake sweating, disoriented, with no memory of what she had dreamed. I documented this. I documented everything, the patterns of her sleep, her daytime behavior, any changes in appetite or mood or sociability. I told myself this was care, was attention, was the vigilance required by our situation. But I was afraid, because I recognized something in her dreams, in the way she moved through sleep, that reminded me of my own experience. The cellular knowledge, the sense of having been somewhere before. I asked her, eventually, directly, Elena, do you ever feel like you've experienced this before? Like you remember things that haven't happened? She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Everyone feels that way sometimes. Déjà vu. It's normal, especially in stressful situations. Not déjà vu, something stronger. Something like, I hesitated, risking everything. Something like what I described to you. Memories of a different timeline, a different life. She was silent for a long time. Then, Anthony, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise not to interrupt, not to react, just to listen. I promised. I don't have your memories, she said. Not exactly, but I have impressions, fragments. Since I was a child, I've dreamed of a world ending, of running, hiding, stealing to survive. Of you. She looked at me directly, and her eyes were frightened, more frightened than I had seen her in the actual dangers we had faced. Of leaving you, of taking things from you, of watching you die. My body went cold. You remember killing me. I remember surviving. Her voice was hard, defensive. I remember being desperate, being alone, being responsible for people who needed me. I remember choices that were terrible and necessary. I remember you dying, yes, but I also remember living. Living when almost everyone else died. We were both silent. The knowledge between us was too large for ordinary speech. We had both been there. We had both died, in some sense, and woken, in some sense, and found each other again in this timeline with our incompatible memories and our shared need. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally. Because you told me first. Because your story was so complete, so certain, and mine was fragments, impressions, things I could dismiss as imagination. Because I wanted to believe you were wrong, that your memories were metaphor or intuition, that the future was still open. And now I believe we both know something. Something impossible. Something that doesn't have a framework for understanding. She reached for my hand, and I let her take it, though I was shaking. Anthony, I don't know if I'm the person who betrayed you. I don't know if those memories are prophecy or history or something else entirely. But I know I don't want to be that person. I want to choose differently. I want to believe that knowing makes choosing possible. I wanted to believe her. The desire was physical, overwhelming, the need to trust that had driven me to tell her everything, to bring her into my preparation, to try a different path than the one that had killed me. But I also remembered dying. Remembered the fever, the abandonment, the understanding that I had been left by the person I loved most. How do I trust you? I asked. How do I sleep beside you, plan beside you, depend on you, knowing what you might become? How do I trust you? She countered. You remember me as a monster. You've been watching me for months, waiting for me to reveal myself, documenting my behavior like I'm a suspect. How do I live with that scrutiny? How do I become someone better when I'm constantly suspected of being someone worse? We had reached an impasse. Two people with impossible knowledge, with traumatic memories, with the desperate need to believe that love could survive understanding. We sat in our fortified barn, in the world we had prepared for the end, and we faced the possibility that our preparation was insufficient. That the danger was not outside, in the plague and the collapse, but inside, in our memories of each other. We need help, Elena said finally. Not just us. Others like us. People who remember, who know what's coming, who might understand what we are. I had considered this. In my research, in my documentation, I had found hints. Others who had predicted the outbreak with unusual accuracy, who had prepared with unusual urgency, who had made choices that suggested knowledge beyond what was publicly available. There are networks, I said. Groups forming online before the internet fails. People calling themselves remembers. Some are frauds, seeking attention or profit. But some know things they shouldn't. We find them, Elena said. We build something larger than ourselves. Something that can survive even if we can't trust each other completely. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was a strategy, a mutual recognition that our individual survival depended on collective knowledge, on the aggregation of impossible experience into something that might guide us through what was coming. We reached out, carefully, pseudonymously, through encrypted channels that would soon become unreliable. We found others. A farmer in Iowa who remembered 3 different versions of the collapse, each with different outcomes. A doctor in Atlanta who had died in a hospital raid and woken in her own past twice, each time with clearer memories. A child in Oregon who spoke of before with the casual certainty of someone describing a vacation. They were not all good people. Some used their knowledge for advantage, for predation, for the accumulation of power that would make them warlords in the world to come. Some were broken, traumatized beyond function, unable to distinguish between memory and hallucination. But some were like us, trying to understand, trying to prepare, trying to believe that knowledge of the worst possible future could create the possibility of something better. We formed a network. The Rememberers, we called ourselves, with the irony of those who cannot forget. We shared information, resources, strategies for survival. We debated the nature of our experience, whether we were travelers, prophets, the beneficiaries of some cosmic error, or simply mad. We did not reach conclusions. We reached each other. And Elena and I continued, partners still, though the nature of our partnership had changed. We slept in the same bed, but kept weapons within reach. We planned together, but maintained independent escape routes. We loved each other, I believe, but we loved with the knowledge that love had not been sufficient in another timeline, that it might not be sufficient in this one. In year 2, the child from Oregon reached out. She was 11 now, or had been 11 when she first remembered, and she had developed a theory. The remembering she proposed was not random. It was triggered by connection, by love, by the intensity of relationship that made death unacceptable. We remembered because we had to save someone. Because the universe, in some sense, permitted second chances to those with sufficient need. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my return was not accident but purpose, that Elena's fragments were not threat but opportunity, that we had been given this impossible gift because we were necessary to each other in ways we had not yet understood. But I also remembered dying, remembered the hatred, remembered that the universe, if it permitted second chances, also permitted repetition, the endless cycling of trauma until it was resolved or until it destroyed those caught in its orbit. Elena and I stood at the beginning of year 3. The world around us was ruins, but our community was strong, our network functional, our survival probable. We faced each other with our weapons within reach and our love uncertain, 2 people who had died and woken and found that the hardest part of apocalypse was not the dying, but the living with knowledge of what we had been. I don't want to betray you, Elena said. I want to believe I can choose differently. I don't want to watch you for signs of betrayal, I said. I want to believe I can see you clearly, as you are, not as you were. We made a pact. Not of trust. Trust was still impossible, but of process. We would document everything, as I had learned to do. We would maintain transparency, share information, prevent the secrecy that enabled betrayal. We would build a relationship that could survive verification, that did not require faith but could function on evidence. It was not love as I had imagined it. It was something harder, more durable, more honest. 2 people choosing each other daily, with full knowledge of what that choice meant, what it risked, what it might prevent. The year 3 I remembered was approaching. The time of my death, of Elena's choice, of the culmination of everything I feared and everything I hoped to change. We were ready. as ready as preparation could make us. The question was not whether we would survive the collapse. The question was whether we could survive each other. Whether love, informed by memory of its failure, could become something that did not fail again. The remembers grew to 47 people by the middle of year 2. 47 individuals scattered across what had been the United States, connected by radio when the internet failed, by messengers when radio became dangerous, by the desperate need to understand what we had become. We established protocols. Security procedures learned from intelligence agencies and prison gangs, adapted for a world where the greatest threat was not enemy nations, but the collapse of trust itself. We verified identities through shared memories, impossible details that no researcher could have predicted, no fraud could have invented. The color of the CDC director's tie when he announced the outbreak. The specific number of cases reported in the first week. The name of the nurse who died in Atlanta, the first healthcare worker to fall, whose death had signaled that this was not containable. These memories bound us. They also divided us, because we did not all remember the same timeline. The farmer in Iowa, David, recalled 3 distinct versions of the collapse. In one, the plague had been contained by year 2, the world scarred but recovering. In another, it had mutated into something airborne, killing 90% of the population by year 3. In his third memory, the one that most closely matched mine, the timeline proceeded as I had experienced, with infrastructure failing gradually and the worst of the violence concentrated in urban centers. We debated what this meant, whether we were seeing possible futures, alternate realities, or simply the distortions of trauma on memory. A woman named Iris, a physicist in her previous life, proposed the most coherent theory, that consciousness was not bound by linear time, that intense experience, particularly death, could create connections across probability space, allowing information to flow between versions of reality that were similar but not identical. "We're not prophets," she said, during one of our encrypted radio conferences. "We're receivers, tuning into frequencies of experience that share our basic parameters. The plague happens in all of them. The details vary. Our choices matter, but they matter within constraints we don't fully control." Iris had died in her first timeline. A laboratory accident, she believed, though her memories were fragmented. She had woken 3 years earlier, like me, but with less clarity, impressions rather than full recollection. She had spent her second life preparing, as I had, but her preparation had focused on understanding rather than survival. She wanted to know why. I had wanted only to live. We met in person in August of year 2. The location was neutral ground, a decommissioned military base in Oklahoma that David had secured through his network of rural contacts. 12 of us gathered, representing the core of the rememberers, those with the clearest memories, the most developed theories, the greatest investment in collective rather than individual survival. Iris was smaller than I expected. Older, though not by much, 50 to my 28, though the collapse had aged us all. She had the intensity of someone who had spent years thinking about questions that could not be answered, the patience that comes from accepting uncertainty. "You're the one who came back with full memory," she said, when we were introduced. "The clear case. Most of us have fragments, impressions, dreams. You remember dying. I remember everything. The hospital, the fever, I stopped, glancing at Elena, who was across the room, talking with David about crop rotation. The betrayal. I remember being left." Iris followed my gaze. "She's the one from your memory? The woman who abandoned you. She's also the woman who didn't. Who's here, who stayed, who's trying to become someone else. And you're trying to believe she can. I'm trying to build a system where it doesn't matter whether I believe. Where verification replaces trust, where transparency prevents the conditions that made betrayal possible." Iris considered this. "That's one approach. The engineering solution. Build a machine that works regardless of the operator's intent." She paused, sipped water from a canteen. "There's another approach. The relational solution. Build connections so strong that betrayal becomes unthinkable. That the person who might betray is transformed by the quality of the relationship into someone who cannot." "I tried that," I said. "In my first life. I loved her completely. I trusted her with my life. And she took my supplies and left me to die. Did you tell her what you knew? Did you share your preparation, your planning, your fears? Or did you protect her from knowledge, thinking that was love? I had no answer. In my first life, I had been secretive, controlling, convinced that I needed to manage everything to keep us safe. I had shared information selectively, had made decisions without consultation, had treated Elena as someone to be protected rather than someone to be partnered with. In this timeline, Iris continued, you told her everything. Impossible knowledge, traumatic memory, your fear of what she might become. That was different. That was, she searched for the word, vulnerable. You made yourself dependent on her response. You gave her the power to destroy you, and she chose not to. She chose not to yet. We're only in year 2. In my memory, the betrayal came in year 3. Then you have time, not to prevent but to build. To create conditions where prevention is possible. Where the person she becomes is not determined by the person she was, but by the relationship you're constructing now. I wanted to believe her. The desire was familiar, the same hope that had driven me to tell Elena everything, to bring her into my preparation, to try a different path than the one that had killed me. But I also remembered the maternity ward, the fever, the understanding that I had been abandoned by the person I loved most. How do you live with the memory? I asked Iris. How do you function, knowing what you know, having died, having woken, having lost everything and gained only information?
You don't, she said.
Not at first. For months, I was non-functional, traumatized by memories of a death that hadn't happened, grieving losses that were technically in the future. I was hospitalized briefly in a psychiatric facility. They diagnosed me with stress-induced psychosis. They were wrong, but they weren't wrong that I was broken. What changed? I found another remember. Before we had a name, before we had a network. Just a woman in my city who had predicted the outbreak with unusual accuracy, who had prepared with unusual urgency. We talked. We compared notes. We realized we weren't alone. Iris smiled, the first expression of warmth I had seen from her. Community doesn't heal trauma, but it makes trauma bearable. It gives you reason to continue functioning, even when functioning feels impossible. The Oklahoma gathering established the formal structure of the Remembers. We created roles, responsibilities, communication protocols that would survive the further degradation of technology. We debated ethics, whether our knowledge imposed obligations, whether we could justify saving ourselves while others died, whether the manipulation of events based on future memory was morally equivalent to the manipulation based on past experience. Elena emerged as a leader in these discussions. Her marketing background, oddly, translated to organization, she understood messaging, coordination, the construction of narrative that could unite disparate people around common purpose. She proposed that we view ourselves not as survivors of alternate timelines, but as pioneers of a new possibility. That our knowledge was not burden but opportunity, not trauma but gift. We can't save everyone, she said, during a session on resource allocation. We can't even save most people. The systems are too large, the failures too distributed. But we can save some. We can create models of preparation, of cooperation, of sustainable community that others can replicate. We can be the proof that different choices are possible. I watched her speak, this woman who had killed me, who might kill me still, and I felt the complexity of my feelings. Love, yes, persistent despite everything. Fear, equally persistent, grounded in experience, I could not dismiss. Admiration, for her competence, her resilience, her ability to function despite her own fragmented memories of survival. And something else, recognition. The understanding that we were similar, she and I, in ways that transcended the specific events of any timeline. We were both trying to become better than our memories suggested we could be. We were both building systems, hers of community, mine of verification, that might permit trust to exist despite knowledge of its failure. After the gathering, we drove back to Tennessee together. The roads were dangerous now, banditry common in the spaces between organized communities, but we had learned to travel in convoy, armed, prepared. Elena drove while I navigated, scanning for threats, monitoring radio frequencies for news of conditions ahead. David thinks we should consolidate, she said, during a long stretch of empty highway. Move the core remembers to a single location, build something defensible, create a seed community that can survive even total systemic collapse. He's not wrong. The network is vulnerable as it is. Too dispersed, too dependent on communication that could fail completely. But you disagree. I hesitated. I agree with the logic. But I distrust the concentration of power. 47 people with knowledge of the future, with preparation that makes them uniquely capable of survival, gathered in one place. That's not just a community. That's a hierarchy waiting to form. A new elite based on impossible privilege. And you don't want to be elite. I don't want to be anything I was in my first life. Controlling, secretive, convinced of my own rightness. I looked at her, the profile I had loved in 2 timelines now. I don't want to build something that replicates the conditions that made me vulnerable. Elena was silent for a mile, 2 miles. Then, Anthony, can I tell you what I remember? Not fragments. The clearest memory I have from whatever timeline it comes from. Yes. I remember you dying. I remember the hospital, the fever, the way you looked at me at the end. Not with hatred. With disappointment. With the understanding that I had failed you, that I was not the person you needed me to be. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. I remember walking away, taking the supplies, telling myself it was necessary, that I had others to protect, that you were already gone, and I was only acknowledging reality. She stopped the car. We were in the middle of nowhere, farmland that had been abandoned when the owners died or fled, nothing visible in any direction. She turned to face me, and her eyes were wet, frightened, more open than I had seen them since I told her my impossible truth. I remember becoming someone I hated, someone who could justify any choice by reference to survival, who lost the capacity to see others as fully real, fully deserving, fully human. I became efficient. I became effective. I became a monster who happened to be on the side of the living. And in this timeline, I'm trying to become someone else. Someone who doesn't require that justification, who can survive without becoming monstrous. She reached for my hand, still weak, but present. But I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if the conditions of survival permit morality. I don't know if I'm strong enough to be good when being good is dangerous. I understood finally what she had been carrying. Not just fragments of memory, but the weight of self-knowledge. The understanding that she was capable of betrayal, that she had been capable, that the capacity remained within her regardless of her desire to be different. I don't know either, I said. I don't know if I'm strong enough to trust you, knowing what you might become. I don't know if my system of verification is protection or prison, if it keeps me safe or prevents the connection that might actually transform us both. We sat in the abandoned farmland, 2 people with impossible memories, with shared fear, with the desperate need to believe that love could survive understanding. The sun set around us, the world continuing its indifferent rotation, the plague continuing its spread regardless of our preparation or our hope. We try, Elena said finally. That's all we can do. Try and document our trying and build systems that support our best selves rather than our worst. And if we fail, she paused, swallowed. If I fail, then at least we will have failed differently. At least we will have tried. We drove on. We reached our community in Tennessee, our fortified barn and our cultivated fields and our network of survivors trying to build something sustainable in the ruins. We reported to the others, shared what we had learned, integrated our experience into the collective knowledge of the remembers. And we continued, partners still in our complicated way, sleeping in the same bed, planning together, facing the emerging darkness as a unit that was not quite trust, not quite verification, but something new we were constructing from the wreckage of what we had been. In year 2, the Rememberers saved approximately 1,200 people. Not through direct intervention, our numbers were too small for that, but through modeling, through the dissemination of preparation strategies, through the proof that survival was possible with knowledge and organization and mutual aid. We became legend in certain circles, the people who had known before anyone knew, who had prepared before preparation was possible. We also became targets. Because knowledge is power, and power attracts those who want it for themselves. In November of year 2, a group of survivors attacked one of our satellite communities, seeking supplies, seeking information, seeking the advantage that preparation conferred. 3 members died. 7 others were wounded. The attackers were repelled, but the vulnerability of our network was exposed. David renewed his call for consolidation. We're too dispersed, he argued, during an emergency radio conference. We need to gather, to defend, to create something that can survive concentrated attack. I opposed him. Consolidation creates a target. A single location that enemies can identify, surround, destroy. Our dispersion is our protection. Dispersion is weakness, David countered. We can't support each other, can't share resources effectively, can't build anything lasting. We can build a model, I said. A network of independent communities, each capable of survival, each connected to others for mutual aid, but not dependent on central authority. That's more robust than any single location. That's anti-fragile. The debate continued for weeks. Elena mediated, proposed compromise solutions, kept the network functioning despite our disagreements. I watched her operate, this woman who had been my killer and was now my partner, and I tried to separate my feelings about her from my assessment of her competence. She was good, better than me at certain things: relationship management, conflict resolution, the maintenance of morale in difficult conditions. She was also, I observed, increasingly frustrated with my suspicion. My documentation of her movements, my independent verification of her reports, my refusal to fully relax the vigilance that had become habitual. "You don't see me," she said one night, after a difficult meeting where I had challenged her data on community morale. "You see your memory of me. You see what I might become. You don't see what I am, what I'm trying to be, what I'm actually doing." "How do I see you?" I asked. "How do I look at you without seeing the maternity ward, the fever, the—" "You're not looking at me. You're looking at a ghost. A possibility. A version of me that exists in your memory, but not in this timeline, in this reality, in this relationship." She was crying now, angry, the controlled composure she maintained in public finally cracking. "I'm here, Anthony. I'm real. I'm trying. And you're so busy protecting yourself from what I might do that you can't receive what I actually am." I wanted to argue, to defend my vigilance as necessary, as rational, as the minimum prudence required by my experience. But I remembered Iris's words in Oklahoma: the engineering solution versus the relational solution. The machine that worked regardless of operator intent versus the connection that transformed the operator. "I don't know how to see you differently," I admitted. "I don't know how to let go of the memory that defines you for me. I've tried. I keep trying. But it's there every time you leave the room, every time you make a decision without consulting me, every time you seem to prioritize the collective over you, over us, over what we have, what we're building, what I need to believe is real." Elena was quiet for a long time. Then, "What if I leave? Not betray you, not steal supplies, just leave. Create distance, independence, a relationship that doesn't require this constant verification. Would that help you? Would that let you see me clearly, without the shadow of your memory?" The possibility was terrifying. Not because I feared losing her, I had lost her before, had died with that loss, but because I feared what it would mean about me. That I was incapable of trust, that my trauma had made me unfit for partnership, that the only solution to my problem was isolation. "No," I said. "Leaving wouldn't help. Distance wouldn't help. I struggled to articulate what I needed, what would permit me to see her as she was rather than as she had been. I need to change. To build something in myself that can receive you, that can trust, that doesn't require constant verification."
How? I didn't know.
Not then. But the question became my focus, my preparation, my survival project, more urgent than food or shelter or defense. I needed to become someone capable of trust, despite knowledge of its failure. I needed to integrate my memory of Elena's betrayal with my experience of her presence, to hold both as true without letting either determine my response. Iris helped. We corresponded regularly, and she proposed techniques, cognitive, emotional, even spiritual, that might permit the integration I sought. Meditation, to observe my reactions without being controlled by them. Journaling, to externalize my fears and examine them as objects rather than truths. Graduated exposure, to deliberately create situations where I relied on Elena and observed the outcomes. The last was hardest. I started small, letting her manage our food inventory without verification, accepting her reports without independent confirmation. When that worked, when she was accurate and honest and transparent, I increased the stakes. Let her negotiate with other communities on our behalf. Let her represent us in disputes. Let her make decisions that affected our survival, our security, our future. Each time, I documented my anxiety. The physical symptoms, elevated heart rate, disrupted sleep, the persistent sense of impending disaster, the cognitive patterns, catastrophizing, mind reading, the assumption that absence of evidence was evidence of betrayal. And the outcomes, her continued reliability, her growing competence, her evident commitment to the community and to me. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, my anxiety decreased. Not disappeared. I still woke sometimes with the memory of the maternity ward vivid as yesterday, still felt the surge of fear when she was late returning from a trip. But the intensity diminished. The duration shortened. The space between trigger and response widened enough that I could choose my reaction rather than being controlled by it. By the end of year 2, I was different. Not healed. Trauma doesn't heal, it integrates, but integrated. Capable of holding my knowledge of Elena's possible betrayal alongside my experience of her actual partnership, without being paralyzed by the contradiction. I told her this, on the anniversary of our arrival at the Tennessee property. We had survived 2 years, built something lasting, contributed to the network of communities that was proving more robust than any single location could have been. I see you now, I said. Not completely, not perfectly, but more clearly than I did. I see your effort, your choice, your becoming. And I see that it's different from what you were, what you might have been, what my memory suggests. She cried, as she had in the farmland, but differently. Relief, not frustration. Recognition, not demand. I see you too, she said. The vigilance, the fear, the constant preparation for disaster. I see how hard you've worked to become capable of trust. And I see that you're still trying, still becoming, still building something new from what you were given. We made love that night for the first time in months. The physical intimacy had suffered from my vigilance, from my inability to relax control, from the fear that vulnerability in one domain would lead to vulnerability in all. But I was different now, or becoming different, capable of presence without protection. Afterward, lying in the darkness of our fortified room, she said, Year 3 is coming. The time of your death, in your memory. The time of my betrayal. I know. How do we face it? I had thought about this. Planned for it, as I planned for everything. We face it together. With everything we've built. Our preparation, our community, our relationship. We face it as people who have chosen differently, who have become capable of different choices. And if it's not enough? If the conditions of year 3 are too strong, if survival pressure overrides everything we've built, then we fail differently, I said, repeating her words from the farmland. We fail having tried, having become people capable of trying. That's more than I had in my first life. That's more than I believed possible. She was silent for a time. Then, Iris thinks the remembering is triggered by connection, by love, by the intensity of relationship that makes death unacceptable. She thinks we remember because we have to save someone. Do you believe that? I believe we remember because we have to become someone. Someone capable of love despite knowledge of its failure. Someone capable of trust despite experience of betrayal. Someone capable of hope despite understanding of despair. She turned to face me, her eyes visible in the faint light from our security monitors. I believe we're becoming that, Anthony. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and fears and the constant possibility of failure. But becoming. I held her, felt her warmth, her breath, her realness. The woman who had killed me and who was trying, with me, to become someone who would not. The woman I loved in 2 timelines, with full knowledge of what that love had cost and might cost again. Year 3 began. The plague continued its spread, the infrastructure continued its decay, the world continued its transformation into something unrecognizable. But we were ready. More than ready, we were becoming. Becoming the people who might survive, not just physically but relationally, not just individually but together. The maternity ward was in the future, or in the past, or in some probability space that might never manifest. I held it in memory, as I held Elena's hand in present reality. Both were true. Both were real. And, between them, in the space of their contradiction, we were building something new. Year 3 arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. The plague, which had been terrible, became worse, a mutation that rendered previous immunity irrelevant, that killed faster and more completely than the original strain. The communities we had built, the networks we had established, began to fail. Not from external attack, as we had feared, but from internal collapse, the slow erosion of hope that comes from watching everyone you know die. I watched our numbers diminish. 1,200 saved in year 2 became 800 by March of year 3, then 600, then 4. The remembers themselves were not immune. David died in April, the farmer who had remembered 3 timelines, who had believed in consolidation, who had been my opponent and my friend. Iris died in May, the physicist with her theories of consciousness and connection, her hope that love could transcend time. Each death was a wound. Each death confirmed the futility of preparation, of knowledge, of the desperate attempt to build something lasting in a world determined to unmake everything. I found myself retreating into vigilance, into control, into the patterns I had worked so hard to transcend. Elena noticed. Of course she noticed. She watched me document deaths with the same intensity one had once documented her movements, saw me calculate survival probabilities with the coldness that had characterized my first life, recognized my withdrawal from connection into management. "You're becoming who you were," she said, in June, after I had refused to authorize a rescue mission for a neighboring community, citing resource constraints and unacceptable risk. "I'm becoming realistic," I countered. "The conditions have changed. The mutation has changed them. What worked before doesn't work now. You're becoming afraid. And your fear is making you small, closed, controlling. The very things you tried to escape." I wanted to argue, to defend my decisions as rational, as necessary, as the only responsible leadership possible in impossible conditions. But I heard Iris in her words, the distinction between engineering and relationship, between systems that worked regardless of operators and connections that transformed the operators themselves. "I'm trying to keep us alive," I said, weaker than I intended. Alive for what? For more survival? More preparation? More vigilance against threats that never end. Elena stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her, the particular scent of her that had survived 2 timelines that I would have recognized in any possible world. "Anthony, what are we surviving for? What are we becoming if we only survive?" I had no answer. Or rather, I had the answer I had always had, from my first life through this one, the answer that drove my preparation and my terror and my desperate need for control. We were surviving for the possibility of becoming, for the chance to be different, to be better, to be capable of love and trust and hope despite everything that contradicted them. But I was losing that possibility, losing it in the daily grind of death management, in the hard choices that saved some by sacrificing others, in the slow transformation of a healer into a warlord, a partner into a commander. "I need to remember," I said. "Not just the dying, the living. What I wanted, what I believed, what I was trying to become." Elena held me. In the command center of our diminishing community, surrounded by monitors showing infection rates and casualty lists and the slow collapse of everything we had built, she held me. And I let her. Let myself be held, be vulnerable, be dependent on her presence and her care and her refusal to become what my memory predicted. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what you wanted, what you believed. what you're trying to become. I told her the story of my first life, not the death, but the living, the hope that had driven my preparation, the love that had made preparation necessary, the vision of a community that could survive without becoming monstrous. The belief that knowledge could be used for transformation rather than control, that memory of failure could enable success rather than predicting it. And I told her about my second chance. The waking, the terror, the desperate need to change everything that had led to my death. The hope that had driven me to trust her, to tell her everything, to try a path that my memory suggested was impossible. I'm still trying, I said. I'm still becoming. But the conditions are so hard, Elena. The dying is so constant. I don't know if becoming is possible when survival requires. Requires what? Becoming hard. Becoming closed. Becoming someone capable of decisions that I can't live with, that I can't integrate, that make me into the very person I was trying to escape. Elena was silent for a long time. Then, what if that's the test? Not whether we survive, but whether we can survive without becoming monstrous. What if the remembering, the second chance, isn't about preventing death, but about preventing the death of who we are? I thought of Iris, her theory that we remembered because we had to save someone. I thought of David, who had remembered 3 timelines and died trying to create a 4th possibility. I thought of my mother, my father, the integrity they had practiced and died for, the inheritance they had left me of becoming rather than being. What if I can't? I asked. What if the conditions are too strong? If survival pressure overrides everything I've built? If I become who I was despite everything I'm trying? Then you failed differently, Elena said, repeating her words from the farmland, from our beginning. You fail having tried, having become capable of trying. That's more than you had. That's more than anyone has, who doesn't remember, who doesn't know, who doesn't struggle with the weight of what they might become. She kissed me. In the command center, surrounded by death, she kissed me. And I felt it, the possibilities she was offering, the choice she was making, the becoming she was attempting despite her own memories, her own fears, her own knowledge of what she had been and might be again. I love you, she said. In this timeline, in whatever timelines exist, I love you. And I'm choosing, now, to become someone worthy of that love. Someone who doesn't betray, who doesn't abandon, who doesn't become efficient at the cost of her humanity. I believed her. Not completely. The memory of the maternity ward was still there, still real, still a possibility that could manifest. But I believed her enough to choose with her, to become with her, to face whatever year 3 would bring as partners, as lovers, as people trying to be better than their memories suggested. The crisis came in August. The mutation had peaked, the dying had slowed, but the social fabric had torn beyond easy repair. A group of survivors, not bandits, not enemies, but desperate people with legitimate need, approached our community seeking refuge. We had resources, barely. We had space, barely. We had the capacity to absorb some, to save some, at the cost of our own security and sustainability. I faced the choice I had always feared, the choice that had defined my first life, that had led to my death, that had been made by Elena in my memory and by me in my preparation. Who to save, who to refuse, how to distribute scarcity when demand exceeded supply. In my first life, I had tried to save everyone, had shared our supplies, had accepted refugees beyond our capacity, had created the conditions that made Elena's betrayal necessary, the desperate need to preserve something for those she prioritized over me. In my preparation for this life, I had sworn to be different, to be realistic, to be controlled, to make hard decisions that preserved our core community even if it meant refusing help to others. But Elena proposed something else. A third path, not possible in my first life, made possible by the network we had built, the relationships we had cultivated, the becoming we had attempted. We can't absorb them, she said, but we can connect them to other communities, to resources we know about, to the infrastructure of mutual aid we've been building. We can be the node that makes their survival possible, even if we can't be the destination. It was risky. It required revealing our network, our knowledge, our carefully protected advantages. It required trust in systems we had built but not fully tested, relationships we had cultivated but not fully depended on.
But it was also right.
The becoming we had attempted, the integration of survival and morality, of preparation and generosity, of vigilance and trust. I agreed. We activated the network, called in favors coordinated with communities across 3 states to absorb and distribute the refugees. It worked, imperfectly, with losses and difficulties and the constant possibility of failure. But it worked better than absorption would have, better than refusal would have, better than the choices available to my first self. And in the working, I felt something shift. The integration I had sought, the becoming capable of trust despite knowledge of betrayal. I had trusted Elena with this decision, with this coordination, with the lives of people who depended on our competence. And she had been worthy, had become worthy, had chosen to be worthy in conditions that made the choice costly and difficult and real. September came. The time of my death, in my memory. The time of Elena's betrayal, of the maternity ward, of the fever and the hatred, and the dying alone. We were different now. The community was different, reduced but resilient, connected rather than isolated, becoming rather than merely surviving. Elena and I were different, partners in a way my first life had not permitted, capable of trust in a way my vigilance had prevented, integrated in a way that held memory without being controlled by it. The specific circumstances of my death did not manifest. There was no hospital in Cleveland, no knife wound, no theft of supplies, no abandonment. The plague continued, the dying continued, but our path had diverged sufficiently that the specific tragedy I remembered became impossible. But other tragedies were possible. Other deaths, other betrayals, other failures of becoming. The universe, I had learned, did not permit second chances without cost. The alteration of one timeline created pressure in others, the necessity of learning through different suffering what could not be learned through repetition. In October, Elena was infected. Not the original strain, we had immunity, partial, developed through exposure and survival. The mutation. The new thing that rendered previous protection irrelevant. She hid it at first, concealed her symptoms, continued her work, maintained the appearance of competence that our community needed. I discovered it accidentally, finding her feverish in our quarters when she should have been coordinating supply distribution. I confronted her. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have stopped me, quarantined me, removed me, protected yourself and the community from my contamination. She was crying, sweating, the fever already advanced. Because I'm not ready to become useless. To become dependent. To become someone you have to care for rather than partner with. You're not becoming anything, I said. You're sick. You need treatment, quarantine, the resources we've prepared for exactly this situation. And if they don't work, if the mutation is too new, if our preparations are insufficient, if I die despite everything, then you die, I said, the hardness in my voice surprising me. But you die having tried, having become capable of trying. That's what you told me in the farmland. That's what we've been building. She laughed, weakly. You're using my words against me. I'm using your wisdom. You're becoming the person you've been trying to be, that I've been trying to see, that we're both trying to build. I took her hand, fever-hot, fragile. Elena, I'm not going to let you hide. I'm not going to let you become efficient, isolated, self-sacrificing in the wrong way. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we're in it together. I quarantined her. Used our best treatments, our experimental protocols, the knowledge we had accumulated through 2 years of preparation and adaptation. I sat with her through the fever, the delirium, the moments when she didn't know my name, when she spoke to people I couldn't see, when she relived memories that might have been from this timeline or another. And I watched. For signs of betrayal, my old vigilance suggested. For the moment when she would become who she had been, would take what she needed, would sacrifice me for her survival. But I also watched for signs of becoming, of the person she was trying to be, that we were trying to build together, that might be capable of love despite knowledge of its failure, of trust despite experience of betrayal. She survived. The fever broke, slowly, leaving her weakened but present, integrated, more fully herself than I had seen her. The person who had hidden her illness from fear of dependence had learned, through the experience of being cared for, that dependence was not betrayal. That receiving help was not the same as taking it. That vulnerability could be met with generosity rather than exploitation. I saw things, she told me, when she was coherent enough to speak. In the fever. Memories or visions or possibilities. Other timelines, other versions. In some of them, I left you. In some, you left me. In some, we never met, never loved, never tried to become anything together. And in this one? In this one we stayed. We tried. We became capable of staying and trying. She reached for my hand, still weak, but present. I don't know if that's enough. If becoming is sufficient, if trying is sufficient, when the world is ending and everyone is dying and our best efforts are so small against what we're facing. It's sufficient, I said, believing it for the first time, fully, completely. The becoming is the point. The trying is the point, not the outcome. We can't control the outcome, but we can control who we are in the face of it. We can become people capable of love and trust and hope, even when those things seem impossible. Elena recovered. Slowly, incompletely, with lasting damage that would limit her function for the remainder of her life. But she recovered present, integrated, more fully herself than she had been. And I recovered something too. The final integration of my memory with my experience. The understanding that my first life had not been failure, it had been preparation. That my death had not been waste, it had been education. That the remembering was not punishment but gift, the opportunity to become someone capable of what had previously been impossible. We continued. Year 3 became year 4, then year 5. The plague stabilized, mutated again into something less lethal, became manageable through the distributed knowledge of the rememberers and the communities we had built. The world did not end. It transformed, diminished, became something harder and stranger than before, but still capable of supporting life, love, becoming. Elena and I had children. 2 daughters conceived in year 4, born in year 5, raised in the community we had built. We told them our story. Eventually, the impossible truth of our remembering, our dying, our waking, our trying. They believed us, or didn't, or believed in the way children believe their parents' mythology, as truth that shapes them regardless of its literal accuracy. I became old. Older than I had been in my first life, older than I had expected to be, in any timeline. The scars of preparation and survival accumulated, the body wearing down from the constant effort of living in conditions that were never easy, never secure, never fully predictable. But I also became whole, integrated. The person who could hold memory of betrayal alongside experience of trust, who could know the worst possibilities while choosing the best, who could die and wake and continue becoming without being controlled by any single version of what had been or what might be. On my deathbed, peaceful, surrounded by Elena and our daughters and the community we had built, I felt something familiar. The loosening of consciousness, the separation from body, the transition that I had experienced once before and had spent a lifetime trying to understand and prevent. Don't be afraid, Elena whispered, holding my hand, her own hand aged and fragile but still present, still real, still the hand of the person who had tried with me, who had become with me, who had made the remembering meaningful through the becoming it enabled. I'm not, I said, and meant it. I've done this before. I know what comes next. And what comes next? I smiled. The smile of someone who had died with hatred and woken with hope, who had learned that the universe permits second chances to those who need them, who had become capable of using those chances for transformation rather than repetition. Whatever we need, I said. Whatever we become capable of needing. The remembering, if it comes again. The becoming if it doesn't. The love, always, in whatever form it can take. I closed my eyes. I felt the familiar transition, the loosening, the possibility of waking somewhere, somewhen, as someone capable of what I had learned. And I did wake. Not in my apartment, not 3 years earlier, not with the immediate knowledge of what was coming. I woke in a different place, a different time, with different memories, but with the same capacity for becoming, the same integration of experience, the same possibility of love despite knowledge of its failure. Elena was there, or someone like her, or the possibility of her. The specific form mattered less than the capacity, the becoming, the choice to try. "You're new," she said, or someone said. "You just arrived." "Not exactly," I replied, feeling the weight of what I carried, the integration of lives lived and died, and lived again. "I've been here before. I'm trying to become capable of being here better." She smiled. The smile I recognized across timelines, across possibilities, across the becoming that was the only constant in a universe of change. "Then let's try," she said. "Together. Whatever comes next." And we did.